In the last episode, I got the 240 running for the first time in almost a year, and in this episode, I'm going to work on getting it drivable. So the first thing I need to do to make this car more drivable is I need to clearance my wheel wells. I put on these much bigger front wheels, and they rub in a couple spots. So I need to figure out where they're rubbing, probably bash that in with a hammer, and then hopefully it'll be good. Alright, so with the wheel pulled off, I can tell that it's been rubbing right there. Very clearly, there's no paint there. I also think it's been rubbing just a little bit right here. And then you can see here where this wiring harness comes out. I built a little plastic guard there to protect that wiring harness. And you can see that it's been rubbing there for a long time. I think even the old wheels were rubbing there. So my plan is to clearance that. I don't trust this guy up here, so I'm probably going to clearance that as well. And then this wiring harness, eventually that's something I probably need to relocate entirely, but for now I'm just going to replace my guard and then try and tuck it as much out of the way as I possibly can, just to keep that going as long as I possibly can, because I really am not looking forward to relocating it. The purpose of the spray paint is twofold. It's going to stop all those hammer marks from rusting, and if the wheel rubs again, it'll rub the spray paint off and I'll know where it was rubbing. And I'll know what I need to hit with a hammer more. That was actually remarkably easy. I thought that would be the hard one. My plan of attack for this loom here is I'm going to pull this grommet out, and hopefully that'll allow me to bring the whole loom up 1 or 2 inches and just get it a bit farther in that area. It really only needs to be moved half an inch away from the tire at most. So we'll see how that works. Then I'll have to come up with something to fill that hole, because I don't really want an open hole straight from my wheel well into my cabin. So what I ended up doing here actually turned out to be pretty simple. I just cut a wedge out of the grommet, and that allowed me to pull this wiring harness way back up into this cavity. And then I zip tied it on this handy little hole right there. And now that's not going to rub on the tire at all. I got that a good 2 or 3 inches farther back. I'm not worried about that at all. I think, I always thought maybe there'd come a day when I had to relocate this wiring harness into this rail. But I think at this point, I've successfully avoided ever having to do that unless I want to put stupid big wheels on this car. So I forgot to explain what I'm doing right now. Basically, I have to remove the interior so that I can replace the positive battery cable, which runs from the front of the car into the trunk. The previous owners of this car were weird in the sense that, like, they didn't put a battery hold down in it, but they made sure to clip the positive battery wire to the chassis every 7 inches, all the way from here into the firewall. Alright, that's the battery cable swap taken care of. Next thing I'm going to do is put it all back together, throw the hood and the body kit back on, and go for a test drive. Alright, since I got the car running, things have been a bit of an adventure. So I was driving it around and it was going pretty well, but I noticed it was running hot. And while I was trying to diagnose why it was running hot, I blew up my turbo. As you can see, this is my old turbo, and for starters, it's got like a 1/4 inch of shaft play, and if you look in at the fins, they are just completely destroyed. This is a cheap China turbo. My best guess is that the shaft play got so bad that the fins started hitting the housing and then they just blew up. This is something I've always seen coming. I bought this turbo used. It's a cheap turbo. My plan was just to let it blow up and then replace it with a more expensive, like a Garrett turbo or something higher quality. Unfortunately, right now, I can't afford to replace it with something higher quality, so I bought this identical China turbo. As you can see, its fins are at least not broken, and it actually has no shaft play at all, which is good. I'm not sure if these turbos were sold by the same manufacturer, but they were definitely made in the same factory. They're almost identical looking, and it should be a pretty easy swap. So I got the new turbo bolted in, but I ran into a bit of a problem. I guess the geometry is slightly different on both turbos, and the downpipe doesn't quite want to line up with the exhaust housing on the new turbo. If I try and push it into place, it just hits the steering column down there. So I'm going to have to do a bit of modification to my downpipe. Basically what I'll have to do is I'll have to cut the flange off and then rotate the pipe on the flange so that the downpipe goes a bit more towards the engine block and a bit more away from the steering column, which is kind of a pain in the ass. I was hoping this would be a direct bolt-up swap, but I mean, that's not that much work. I can handle it. Alright, so I got the downpipe modified and it now fits up to the turbo no problem. It's really not my best welding work. I haven't welded in a really long time, and I'm using a hella cheap Princess Auto welder. So all things considering, that's about as good as it's going to get. Alright, the turbo's all hooked up. Oil feed and drain, intercooler and intake. I got the O2 sensor back in. Now the only thing left to do is to fire this thing up and see if it's making boost. Alright, now that I got the turbo problem solved, it's time to work on the next problem that's preventing me from driving this car regularly, and it's that it's running quite hot. It's not overheating, it's not pegging on the temp gauge, but it is at the high end of the temp gauge all the time. As soon as it gets up to temp, it goes straight up to hot. And a quick look at my coolant overflow beer bottle tells me pretty much all I need to know. When I filled up my cooling system at the beginning of this year, I filled it with water, and that's what it looks like now, because the whole cooling system is just full of rust. I filled it with water last summer, and then I let it sit all winter, and it just rusted the cooling passages in my block. And then my coolant picked up a bunch of rust, and now it's not cooling very well. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to flush the cooling system as much as I can, get the rust out. I'm probably going to have to flush it like 5 times to get as much rust out as I can. And then I'm going to fill it up with actual coolant, which won't rust the inside of my block more. And then, yeah, that hopefully should do the trick here. I just popped off the lower radiator hose, and the water that came out was straight red with rust. So I'm very confident now that's why my car's not cooling well. And on the bright side, all that red water that came out, that's a bunch less rust that's now in my radiator. So baby steps. All right, now that I got the radiator drained, I'm going to pop the coolant plug on the block and drain the block and hopefully get a bunch more rusty water out of it. Of course, it's right under my insanely hot exhaust. Alright, so I got the block drained and the radiator drained. I flushed some water through both of them just to kind of flush out any last remaining crap. Now I'm going to put the drain plugs back in, fill the cooling system up, and run it for a while. And then I'm going to repeat the flush process. And I'm going to do this maybe 2 or 3 more times just to make sure that I'm flushing out absolutely everything I possibly can. And then the last time around, I'm going to fill it up with actual coolant instead of tap water, just so that it doesn't get rusty again. Honestly, I'm probably not going to film most of this because there's really not much to see and it's really hard to get the camera in the tight spaces. But maybe I'll do a time lapse. Alright, so after the first flush, I just took the car for a cruise to get the coolant flowing, and I can see that's, again, my coolant overflow bottle is full of rusty water, and that was empty when I started driving, so that all came from the cooling system. So looks like we need a couple more flushes here. Alright, so after 3 flushes and 3 test drives, the coolant is starting to come out clear. So I'm going to do one more flush with water just for safety, and then I'm going to fill it up with coolant. Alright, so my overheating issue is completely gone. I replaced the thermostat, and all that coolant flushing I did means that now the car runs perfectly at operating temperature, no overheating at all, which is great. But the day I was doing the coolant flush, I was driving it around afterwards just to make sure it wasn't overheating, and I got pulled over, and I got a warning because my exhaust is too loud. Now, in any other year, I would just throw the warning away and not do anything about it. But this year has been an insane summer for exhaust tickets where I live. Everybody's getting targeted. Everybody's getting tickets. Anything like noticeably louder than stock is getting people fix-it tickets. It's getting cars impounded. It's getting people warnings. And I don't really want to deal with it. So I'm going to do a bit of work to my exhaust to make it a bit quieter here. Obviously, I can't make it as quiet as stock because this car is nowhere near stock, but I'm going to see if I can make it quieter enough that I don't get harassed by the cops every time I drive it. Alright, I got the exhaust out of the car, and you can see why it's so loud. It's just 3-inch straight pipe all the way back, and it's got this tiny little muffler at the very end that does absolutely nothing. This is some crappy little MagnaFlow micro fart can. I swear to God it's not what I ordered. I ordered a much larger fart can that I thought would do much more muffling, but in the end, this is what showed up. This is like 6 inches long. It does absolutely nothing. This car might as well be straight piped. So I've got this much larger MagnaFlow oval muffler that I think is going to do a lot more effective job of muffling this car. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this muffler off, and I'm going to replace it with this much bigger muffler. Then I'm going to take this muffler and I'm going to put it somewhere farther up in the exhaust and see if it can't be a little bit useful as a resonator. Alright, I got the exhaust hacked up. So this is basically what it's going to look like. That's where it attaches to the downpipe, and then I got this small muffler in here as a resonator, and then at the end where the small muffler used to be, I'm going to have the big muffler. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to put the exhaust back under the car, so I can mock this up and put a couple tack welds in it, and then pull it back out and weld everything up, and then hopefully my car should be nice and quiet. Alright, this is the exhaust pretty much finished up here. I got the front muffler in, the back muffler in. The last thing I got to do is basically just clean up the back of it. This whole end of it here peeks out through my bumper. You can see the whole thing, so I'm going to get rid of the ugly end of it, get rid of this upside down exhaust hanger obviously from the car that this muffler came off of, and then probably put just a little bit of a tip on it, just so it doesn't look like the end of a muffler sticking out. And yeah, then we should be good to put this thing back in the car. So I'm stuck here on the side of the road. My car stopped working. I was doing a shakedown of my new exhaust system, which worked perfectly, by the way. And then something tragic happened. My shop vac hose intake has finally met its end. I was driving along, and I guess it got sucked into the fan, and it cleaved it straight in two. I called my buddy Dalton. He brought me some duct tape. We duct taped it back together, which got me home. But the whole thing is ready to go. It's time for me to build an actual intake. Luckily, I have everything I need to build an intake right here. So the plan is that the new intake will come out of the turbo here, turn 90 degrees, go along the front of the radiator. It'll duck under this coolant hose here, and then the air filter will sit over here underneath this charge piping. And I think that's about as good as I can get it. There's really not a lot of space in this engine bay to be building super intricate air intakes unless you're building them out of shop vac hose. Before I can do any of that, I have to give my shop vac hose intake a proper burial. It served me well. It really saved my ass last year when I couldn't get my car running because I didn't have a proper intake. I'm actually going to give it a test fire before I go through all the hassle of putting the hose clamps on, because if it doesn't work, I don't want to have to unscrew 5 hose clamps. Alright, so it seems to be working perfectly. If it wasn't working good, you'd be able to tell because it would not catch idle again after I revved it up. But I was revving it up, it was coming back to idle, everything was good. So I think I'm going to throw some hose clamps on there and then figure out a way to support it. Alright, so I thought I was going to have to finish this up by building a mounting bracket to support the heavy end, that's the MAF and the pod filter, but it turns out by sheer accident, I accidentally made it so these bolts on the MAF kind of hook into the radiator and it supports itself. So I've put about 100 kilometers on this new intake so far and it's worked flawlessly. It's not getting too close to the fan. This part isn't moving around and causing me any problems. So I'm ready to call that done. Nothing left to do now but take it for a drive and see how it sounds with the new exhaust and the new intake. That's how you do drive-by shots when you only have one person. Alright, so as I'm sure you could tell, the car's a lot quieter now. I think it sounds a little raspy, but honestly I'll take raspy over trumpety any day. All I really cared about was that it would be quiet. When your car is this teal, you really don't need to be loud. And yeah, everything's working good. The resonator I put in the middle does scrape a little bit, but really not that much, really only in one specific place, which is the exit of my condo complex, which is kind of annoying because that's the place that I have to drive to leave, but whatever. Alright, stay tuned for next time. I still got a heap of stuff to do with this car. As always, this car is nowhere near being done. No matter how much work I do to it, it somehow seems to get farther and farther away from getting done. But stay tuned and we'll see what happens.